Cool. So we've got quite a few people now, and it's 1 minute past 11, so I think we're good to go. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this webinar on the life cycle of Parliament. My name is John Son. I'm from the Parliamentary Engagement team here at Parliament, and I'll be your host for today. So joining me is an expert panel of guests. We've got Eva Maffey, who is the Opening of Parliament Project Manager at New Zealand Parliament. Hi, Eva.
Hello.
We've got David Bagnall, who's the Principal Clerk Procedure at New Zealand Parliament. Hey, David.
Kia ora koutou.
We have Greg Vaughan, who's Official Secretary at Government House, and Heather Mills, who is an educator at Government House. Hi, Greg and Heather.
Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou.
Hi. So thanks to everyone for joining today and lending your expertise. Just a bit of housekeeping before we do get started. If you've got any questions along the way, feel free to pop them into the chat. We'll try and answer them as we go, and otherwise we do have a section at the end dedicated to answering your questions. So just feel free to chuck them in the chat as we go. Cool, and we'd just like to take this chance to recognise Māori Language Week. We hope you've been taking the time to learn some new te reo phrases and brush up on your te reo. We will be posting a link with some resources, links to some further resources if you're interested in learning more. So feel free to check that out after the webinar. So just to give an overview of what we'll be talking about today. So we'll start by talking about the term of Parliament. So basically what we mean when we talk about a parliamentary term, how long that runs for and what it actually involves. And you might have heard on the news recently talk of the dissolution of Parliament. So we'll go into what needs to happen for a parliamentary term to officially end before a general election. And then obviously we have the general election, and then after that, a new parliamentary term opens. So we'll talk about a bit about the process of the opening of a new parliament and the sort of ceremonies that go behind that. And then as mentioned earlier, we'll have a bit of time at the end for some questions and answers. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to pass you on to Greg and Heather to talk us through the term of Parliament.
Thank you. So this slide, a simple slide, and it's intended to make an important point. We talk about Parliament all the time, and most of the time we do that, we mean the wrong thing. We think of the place where policy and politics are discussed, obviously the heart of Parliament, and where that happens, it's at the House of Representatives. Often we forget that Parliament actually has two parts. It also includes the sovereign. That beautiful photograph of the Queen of New Zealand, Elizabeth II, normally represented by the Governor-General. And so Parliament means two things. And this is never more clear than the moment when a bill emerges from the House and is presented to the Governor-General for her signature. And when she does give that signature, the royal assent, only at that point does that bill become an act and therefore have the force of law. So that demonstrates very clearly Parliament is two things, the sovereign and the people's elected representatives. And that's the message of this slide, and I think we're turning on to others about the role of the sovereign.
Okay, so would you like to tell us a bit more about the role of the sovereign in the context of the life cycle of Parliament?
Sure. So I guess in terms of the life cycle of Parliament, and that's normally a 3-year term in New Zealand, the Governor-General, on behalf of the Queen, as the head of state, dissolves Parliament. And she does that by issuing a proclamation, which literally ends that term of Parliament. In that proclamation, she will also give the date that Parliament must meet again by. And that's really important, because what it's showing is that the Sovereign has a commitment to the continuance of our Parliament, the continuance of the democratic process. So in the proclamation which was announced, usually often on the steps of Parliament, but sometimes it's just published in the Gazette, it will say both that Parliament is dissolved, the 52nd Parliament is dissolved, and that Parliament must meet again by a certain date. And it's kind of a nominal date. At the moment, it's the latest date Parliament can meet is the 24th of December, which would be really inconvenient. But that will change after the election results come through. The Prime Minister will probably, new Prime Minister will put a new date to meet. So that's the dissolution. After that, there's the writ, which has happened quite recently. And the writ is issued by the Governor-General. What it does is it hands the control of the electoral process over to the Chief Electoral Officer who manages the election. After the election, the Governor-General will appoint the new government, which is as a result of the sort of discussions that take place and the results that come in after the election. And then eventually she will summon the new government to meet, the new Parliament to meet. And that's a two-stage kind of process. Two days of openings take place. So they're all really important steps in the process that have a long history in terms of the traditions that were handed down over many years. They have a New Zealand flavour as well, so our system is not exactly the same as the one in the UK, because we have developed our own spin on lots of things. But they are very, very important steps to make sure that everything is done properly. And also that as I say, that the Governor-General, the Sovereign, has that commitment to ensuring that we have that continuance of democratic government.
Mm.
So I think that's it. Anything else, Greg?
I think that's all for now.
Good.
Yeah, so I guess one really key point to make here is that while we have terms of Parliament, so one Parliament ends and then another one begins, and there's the 3-year term, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But it's the same House of Representatives. It's the same one that met back in 1854, and it continues on. In fact, it's not just sort of a historical finding that it's the same one. The law actually says this. This is the great thing about working around here. You actually still have bookshelves. Here's one. And this is the Constitution Act, and it says that the House of Representatives is the same body as the House that was referred to in the original New Zealand Constitution Act 1852 that established our whole sort of constitutional system. So that's a really important point. The term of Parliament ends, but the House itself is a continuous body. Of course, it can't meet, that's the thing. And it's about to renew its membership through the election process. But as a body, the House itself continues. And there's a couple of practical implications of that. One is that the House has an ability to continue considering the business that was dealt with in the previous term of Parliament. It can make a decision to what we call reinstate the business that was previously in front of it, and that doesn't happen in all parliaments. I'd have to say it's a thing that we've developed in New Zealand. The idea that the business can continue from one term to the next, and the other implication of this is that the House's rules stay in place, and the House, of course, sometimes it renews those rules and updates them, but the House's standing orders, as we call them, they do stand from one term of Parliament to another. So that's the key thing there, that the House itself keeps going even though the term of Parliament ends. So another thing that's in the Constitution Act is the limit of the 3-year term, and this is a really firm feature of our electoral system, our electoral cycle, is that it's no more than, well, the term of Parliament is no more than 3 years. That can be slightly more than 3 years between elections, because the 3 years the clock starts ticking on the date that's fixed by the Governor-General for the return of the writ. So you recall Heather talked about the writ being issued, and it's got a date for the when it has to come back, which is really, I guess, when the official result comes in. And then it's 3 years from then. And that's a maximum term. Of course, you can have parliaments that are less than 3 years, and occasionally we've had what we call snap elections, where the government decides to call it early and have a shorter term. That doesn't happen all that often. It's interesting that we haven't always had a 3-year term. Back in 1852, when Westminster passed the the Act that the 1852 New Zealand Constitution Act, they gave New Zealand the same term that was then in place in the UK. In fact, it's still the case in the UK that they've got a 5-year term, and that lasted until 1879 when they passed a law that shortened it to 3 years. And there was lots of argument then about whether that was a good thing, and I guess the principle was that it meant that there was greater accountability from a 3-year term. On the other side, people were arguing that elections are expensive, and having them more frequently makes a greater financial burden for the individuals who are standing for Parliament, having to do all the expensive things you have to do when you're running for electoral office. So that 3-year term has largely been in there since. There have been some changes to that occasionally. During World War I and World War II, in both cases, there were laws that enabled the Parliament to continue for a bit longer during those times of crisis. And also in the 1930s, the government made a decision to promote a law that changed it to 4 years. And that only lasted for a short time. The next government after it came in changed the law back again, so it was only 3 years. So that was in 1935. So there's been a bit of variation, but generally 3 years has been where things are at. And the term is entrenched, so that means that it would require a special majority of Parliament or a referendum to change it from 3 years. We don't have many laws that are entrenched, and that's one of them. There have been some suggestions occasionally for it to be changed to 4 years, and some people might think that's a good idea, and others might argue against it, possibly for the same reasons that they were doing so back in 1879. And we've actually had 2 referendums about this already. So one in 1967 and another in 1990. And the remarkable thing is that in both cases, so you'll see the pie chart there, the 69%. Well, that was obviously a 69% against in both cases. So there was a pretty clear result in each of those. I don't know whether it would still be a similar result. Who knows? I think it's really worth mentioning that New Zealand is way below the global average. So you'll see there the fairly spectacular bar graph. We're in that little orange box on the left. You'll see that New Zealand is much shorter. There's only so that's, hold on. That's showing for unicameral parliaments, and if you combine that with so unicameral parliaments are ones where there's only one house, I guess. So in some countries there's an upper house and a lower house. In New Zealand there's only the one. We used to have an upper house, but that's another story. And when you combine that with other parliaments where there is a lower house, so that's about 190 countries overall, there's only 9 out of that whole 190 countries where there is a term of between 1 and 3 years. So we share that with places like Australia, I think Mexico, there's a few others. There are 2 countries that have a ridiculous term of 2 years, and one of them is Micronesia, and I wonder if anyone could put in the chat maybe a guess about what the other country is that has a ridiculously short 2-year term. We'll see if anyone can come up with the right answer there. So yeah, we're way below the global average, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, so it's worth noting that, and we'll talk about the opening of Parliament in a while, but once Parliament is opened, so the Governor-General does have that initial role of calling Parliament to meet, so summoning Parliament. But then after it's initially opened, it's then up to the House to decide when it will meet. And so I guess that's the point here, is that there are various rules of the House, the standing orders. Look, always have a copy handy. The rules of the House stipulate the pattern of sittings and allow the House to establish its own program of sittings. So we've got the sitting program shown there. the idea that the House sets in advance the days that it will meet. So the Governor-General gets things going after the election, so really perpetuates the cycle and then leaves the democratic institutions to run for themselves thereafter. The Business Committee, I should say, it's one of the committees of Parliament that decides what the program will should be. It recommends the program of the House, and it also can vary the sittings by adding and subtracting days. So should we move on to the next slide? Oh, have we got any guesses about the country with the 2 year?
We've had one guess, the United States.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so we talk about, obviously we've got an election coming up in the US. It's not just the presidential election. There's also the House of Representatives, and some of the senators will be up for, those seats will be up for grabs. The thing about that is that they also have what they call a midterm election. So all of those seats of the House of Representatives, there's a further election every 2 years. It seems crazy to me, but that's just my opinion.
All right, well, that takes us to the dissolution of Parliament, which we mentioned earlier was when a term of Parliament officially ends. So Eva, can you tell us more?
Yeah. So as John and Heather spoke about before, the dissolution, yes, is a legal power that the Governor-General has, but she exercises on the advice of the Prime Minister. So you may have noticed that we originally had a date set for the dissolution, but that was moved because of course, the times that we're in with COVID. And we're going to talk a little bit about COVID-19's impact on these ceremonies for this year. But just to quickly run you through, I guess, the key players. Here on the screen, we have the Sergeant at Arms. So he is an officer of Parliament responsible for assisting the Speaker to keep peace in the House. So he can remove people from the House if they're becoming unruly. But yeah, just a representation of, I guess, the Speaker's authority. Herald of Arms. So Philip O'Shea, he told me, I think this is his 23rd or 24th opening of Parliament this year. So he's been New Zealand's first and only Herald of Arms extraordinaire. So he's the formal communication and liaison between the royal household and Parliament and the government here. We've got the clerk, of course, the deputy clerk and the principal clerk. They served as witnesses to the dissolution this year. So just to make sure that the dissolution did indeed occur, they signed papers to confirm that. And our tumu whakaare, as Heather said, our ceremonies have come a long way from what they used to look like in Westminster with our the bicultural nature. We usually have a kapa haka group, but unfortunately with COVID that wasn't to happen, as you'll see from the photo here. So as we talked about, a proclamation is the formal document made and signed by the Governor-General. And so formally, this has to be published in the New Zealand Gazette, which is the government publication. You can find it online, and I think a link is going in the chat. But more recently, we've started to do a dissolution ceremony so that the public can come and watch, because it's an important event in their democracy. Unfortunately, this year, because it was wet weather on the day, we had to take it inside. And
very windy too, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah. Very windy. Here is the Legislative Council chamber that we can see on the screen here. As you can see, everyone's very socially distanced and the hand sanitizer on the table. Yes. So yeah, just I guess in terms of adapting to COVID, usually outside we have trumpets for a fanfare. So unfortunately we couldn't have those this year. I think something about the spread of germs through playing instruments. And no kapa haka group, unfortunately. So it was a very short ceremony, wasn't it, David? But still, the public could watch because we had it live streamed both on Facebook and on Parliament TV, which was great. And you can watch that later on our Facebook page. It's very short, shouldn't take too long. Yeah.
So we did have a bit of a discussion about whether that counted as being publicly read, and felt on advice that that was the case. And I have to say, I mean, it seems a bit less desirable to have it in the building than out sort of in a public spot on the forecourt. But definitely, there were more people watching then than there used to be when I first started working at Parliament. That same table was popped on the steps, and people would troop out in their gowns and so forth, and sign bits of paper, and the occasional bemused passerby might scratch their heads and wonder what was going on. I think just to add, that this is kind of an additional thing, isn't it? The ceremony is kind of additional to reading the Gazette notice. And
it's sort of not necessary, is it? But it's a really nice to have when we can do it.
Yeah, and it affects the timing as well, with the because it's the moment when it's publicly read that is when the proclamation takes effect, rather than when it's published in the Gazette. And this did lead to, I mean, this is partly, I mean, again, it is a nice ceremony, but also there is that practical aspect of the fact that it can be done potentially more quickly, although the Gazette comes out pretty fast these days, I think. But back in 1984, when Mr. Muldoon was interested in having an early election in June 1984, he was hoping to have that take effect before the House met at 9:30 the next morning. And I gather it was a bit of a struggle to get the Gazette out in time for that to happen before the House came back. And so I think this ceremony does, so it came in the Constitution Act 1986, and I think that's partly in response to the, that experiment, I guess, with how quickly gazettes could be produced to make effect. But also it's just such a nice ceremony that really gives a sense of closure to things.
We've just had a question from one of our viewers while we were talking about the dissolution. It's, what is that golden thing they walk into Parliament with called or used for?
Oh, golden thing. I'll go
It
back.
must be the mace.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's the
Mace?
mace. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't actually feature. So you'll see that the sergeant isn't carrying it during the dissolution.
The Herald of Arms does carry a baton, as you can see in this picture, but no, the mace wasn't involved in this ceremony, but it is involved in the opening ceremonies, which we'll talk about a bit later.
Yeah. And so we were, I think, just moving on to the slide where we talk about what happens if there isn't a dissolution. So we talked earlier about the 3-year term. So that's the maximum of 3 years from the date fixed for the return of the writ. So what happens if you exceed that? Well, if you exceed the 3 years, then Parliament ends automatically. It expires. So that's the official term, and that doesn't happen really. It's usually headed off by the Governor General issuing a proclamation. And there was one case when the Parliament did expire that we know of, and that was back in 1946. And the thing is that they didn't realise at the time that it had expired. It turns out that, well, I guess the first thing is that I think there was a bit of confusion because the previous term of Parliament had ended in 1943, and it was all a bit irregular because there'd been that longer term of Parliament then. But somehow confusion arose, and in 1946, when they, I guess, attempted to dissolve Parliament, it actually expired a few weeks earlier in October 1946. But they didn't even realise then. It came to light a few years later, and it sounds, I'm not quite sure what the story is here, but there was a World War II veteran, Thomas Falkman Simpson. I'm not sure whether he was listening on his wireless or somehow he heard the Attorney General mention that, oh yes, we've noticed that the term of 1946 expired, and there was Mr. Simpson was motivated to write a letter to the Evening Post, sort of complaining about this fact and wondering about whether that in fact meant that various other sort of legal complications had occurred. And then, what do you know, he took it to court. He went to what was then the Supreme Court, I guess what the equivalent of what we'd call the High Court, and then on to the Court of Appeal, which was basically the highest court in the land, apart from going to London in those days. And he pursued this case himself because he felt that the expiration of Parliament and the fact that from then on all the various terms of Parliament that followed after that had exceeded their time limits as well, or that they hadn't been properly formed, and that obviously would cause complications. And he particularly challenged the validity of some bills that had been passed by the Parliament, or by the General Assembly, the two houses of Parliament as we had then, and then, you know, before the term expired, but then had been passed to the Governor General for royal assent after Parliament had already expired. So quite a complicated case, but I mean, I'd really like to know more about Thomas Falkman Simpson. If anyone out there is looking for a small sort of historical study to do, I'd really like to know more about this very determined veteran who I think he lived in Lower Hutt. And it actually, you know, the case, you know, obviously the court did find that things were okay, that in fact the expiration hadn't led to the complete disintegration of our electoral cycle. And in fact, there was quite a useful quote that came from the Court of Appeal. It said that the main object of the Electoral Act is to sustain and not to destroy the House of Representatives. And I think that's a really nice point in principle, that what this whole thing is about is not, you know, it sets these dates in legislation where things must happen and when things do happen. But the whole point is not to make everything grind to a halt if there is a failure. I mean, there won't be any failures, I promise you. But in that case, where things didn't quite work properly, the point of the law was really to sustain and keep things going. So that's a nice little aside about the one time we've had an expiration of Parliament. Now, just finally mention the word interregnum, which sometimes gets mentioned. I suppose if you look at that word in a literal sense, people might say that that's a bit odd. It looks like it says the time between sovereigns, but in fact we use it very, very loosely, I guess, to describe the time between Parliament being dissolved and the new Parliament being opened. Some people might call it the election period, but it kind of continues a bit after the election as well, until the opening of Parliament. So if you hear people talk about the interregnum, it's a bit confusing, but that's really what they're talking about.
And I guess just to cut in there too,
Yeah.
there's a really important thing to remember, is that the government continues even during that period where Parliament has sort of been dissolved. We still have a government running things until we get a new government.
Exactly, we must have a government at all times. Yeah.
Cool, well that leads nicely to the next section. Greg and Heather, could you tell us about how a new government is formed after the election?
Sure. So we're going to kind of divide this into two. I'm going to talk a bit about the Governor General's role in appointing a government, and then Greg's going to talk a little bit about the ceremony to do with it. But it's really important to remember, of course, that the Governor General, like the Queen, is not political. And forming a government is an inherently political process. The politicians, they've been elected. There's all the negotiations that go on, and the Governor General is not involved in those negotiations in any way. It's very, very important that she stays out of it, really, because just like the Queen, she has to. So what she will rely on is the parties, as they go through their negotiation process and the election results are all there, making their public statements about where they stand, who they're in coalition with, making really clear, unambiguous statements about where the confidence of the House will lie. And the confidence of the House really just means your ability to get stuff done, I suppose, to control the House. We can have any combination under MMP of parties, and potentially you can even have a minority government. But the leader of the party that can control the House, has the confidence of the House, will eventually contact the Governor-General and say, I can form a government, but they don't just take that person's word for it. It actually has to be shown in those statements that have been made public, so that both the Governor-General and the general public have confidence in the new government going forward. And once that is clear, who has the confidence of the House, then that party leader is invited to Government House to be appointed by the Governor-General. So we say the Governor-General appoints the Prime Minister and appoints the ministers, but of course, she's not actually making a personal choice in it. It's not like a job interview. It's based on the election results and the discussions that follow after the election.
Yeah, the job interview is the election campaign, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, I love this slide, and here we have the photograph of Ms. Ardern's first administration. Although I have to admit that I have a sneaking envy for your beautiful photos of our friends in the parliamentary system wearing their wigs. From now on, wigs are going to be compulsory at Government House, Heather. But what we have here, as you can see, Her Excellency the Governor-General, with Ms. Ardern and Mr. Peters and the other members of the executive, the one that took office about 3 years ago in October 2017. And so what we're talking about here is the decision having been made. Heather was talking about how it is that the Governor-General will know which person to invite to form an administration. And in some ways, it's very simple. There are two things that the Governor-General looks for. She looks for numbers, arithmetic. That's how one person can demonstrate that they command the confidence of the House. And if the House, as it usually is, will have 120 members, though the number sometimes is higher, but if it has 120, then someone needs to count to 61 at least and be solid on that. And the other thing that the Governor-General looks for is public statements from the leaders of the political parties on where they stand. And our system works really well, and those things do happen. One of the subtleties in all this is that the Governor-General does have a degree of initiative in determining where the confidence of the House lies, and if need be, could use that initiative. But the whole purpose of these things is that the Crown does not have to use those old powers, the so-called reserve powers, because the members of Parliament, the newly elected politicians, exercise their responsibilities and make clear who can form the next government. And that's what we see in this photo, which was taken at Government House in Wellington. I really hope people come to see this building because it means a lot for New Zealand's sovereignty, for our stability of government, and for the democracy. And at some point in the next few months, when the next administration takes office, there will be another photograph like this. This comes, of course, at the end of the ceremony when these people, one imagines in their political lives anyway, are having the best day of their careers. They're all smiling. And what has happened before this is that the Governor-General has determined that Ms. Ardern can form an administration that will command the confidence of the House. She commissions Ms. Ardern to form an administration. And from that instant, the moment that Ms. Ardern became Prime Minister, she then becomes the principal advisor to the Crown and the person entitled to give advice to the Governor-General. And all the other members of the ministry, the executive, are appointed on that advice. So it's an important thing. The Prime Minister comes first. All the other members of the executive come after that on her recommendation. And at the other end of this political cycle for some people, the moment when someone loses their office, the Prime Minister can do that without having to consult the person because they rely on her appointment through the Governor-General. So that's the significance of this photo.
I should add, if there is a change in government, then the old Prime Minister rocks up beforehand and has to give the resignation, so that the new Prime Minister can be appointed.
So after a government is formed, a new parliamentary term is ready to open, and Eva will talk us through what that involves.
Wonderful. Yes, so we have our election timetable, which has changed a little bit, but you can find this on our website as well, which is quite useful, showing you each step of the process. So as you can see here, the last date is the state opening of Parliament, as Heather said, technically could go to 25th December, but isn't going to, because Christmas is a public holiday. So as you can see, yes, the formation of government is no set date, but when the return of the writ, when that happens, 6 weeks after, the opening ceremonies have to take place. So there's quite a gap, 13 November, 24th December, but somewhere in there, the ceremonies will be set. Usually they're held on a Tuesday and Wednesday, but that could change. We'll see what happens, I guess.
You'd hope for a bit of a gap so that the opening can be organised properly once we know who the members are. You've got to send out the invitations and so, yeah.
And we really don't want to ruin anyone's Christmas, do we?
No.
Just really interesting, and I've never seen so many people on Parliament steps, but that the Queen came to open Parliament in 1954 and was the first reigning monarch to visit New Zealand, and it was an incredibly popular event at that time. Hopefully we can get 50,000 people watching along on PTV. Yes, so looking resplendent there. So what actually happens, we kind of structure it into 2 days, but kind of 3 separate events. So we have the commission opening on day 1, the confirmation of speaker on day 1, and then day 2 is usually the state opening. But this could change. It could be held, well, very unlikely to all be held on one day, but it could be held over several days, depending on the style of event, or especially with COVID as well. So just to go a bit more into actually what happens at those ceremonies. So the commission opening is called the commission opening because the Governor-General sends 3 very senior commissioners, so of the judiciary, so usually the Chief Justice, and 2 other senior commissioners to come and open Parliament on their behalf. So they'll come over from the courts over to the debating chamber here at Parliament and declare it open. What happens next after that is that all members of Parliament, whether they've done several terms or whether they're brand new, they all have to swear an oath or an affirmation of allegiance. And if they don't do this, they won't be able to vote in the House or give speeches or anything like that in the House. So they're quite motivated to get this over and done with. So oath is usually done using a holy book. So could be the Bible, could be the Quran, or another holy book that the member, uses. And members can swear their oath or affirmation in English or te reo, and they may then repeat their oath or affirmation in another language if they wish. And what happens after that is the election of the speaker. So if there is one candidate for speaker, that's an automatic election. If there's 2, there's a personal vote. And if there's many candidates, it's kind of by roll call elimination down. So usually this process is quite smooth because they've kind of talked about who will be the speaker beforehand, but anything can happen.
And Eva, I think for the person who was asking about the mace, there's an image of it just there too.
Yes.
That's true. Actually, one other thing I guess people might notice about the swearing in is that sometimes members are called forward to do the oath or affirmation one at a time, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 or even 4 who come up at the same time, and people sometimes might wonder why they're in smaller or bigger groups. Can you explain that, Eva?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So totally right. That's kind of a bit of a logistics thing is the MPs swear in alphabetically, but of course they have their preferences about how they want to swear their oath or affirmation. So they're kind of grouped in pairings of, if you have 3 in a row who want to do an oath in English, they'll all come up and do it at once. I think if everyone did it individually, it might take all day. So it's a way of, just I guess getting through the ceremony. We are looking at different ways to do this, of course, with COVID, so physical distancing as well. So it might look a bit different this year. But yeah, it is a special moment, especially for new MPs. It's kind of, really significant that they're making this commitment as a member of the House of Representatives. Wonderful. So usually just following that ceremony is the confirmation of the Speaker. So the Speaker, who has been just elected, will travel up to Government House with a sergeant, with a mace.
That mace again. Yeah.
And yes, requests that the Governor-General confirm them as Speaker, and also grant some things. One of those is the freedom of speech for the House, and also parliamentary privilege, which is a legal immunity for members in terms of what is spoken in the House. So if they will request that from the Governor-General, and the Governor-General will grant that to them. Yeah,
and that's a tradition, I guess. I mean, there is a legal basis in statute law that provides that legal protection, but this is a tradition that sort of reinforces and affirms that goes back. I can't remember the precise day when exactly that started. One of the speakers in early times claimed these freedoms, I guess.
And there are so many things in these ceremonies, aren't there, that really date back hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, it's just a fascinating kind of internet wormhole to dive down and find out where they come from.
I should know that.
And all these proceedings, the commission opening is live streamed on Parliament TV, and the confirmation of Speaker ceremony is usually recorded and then played back, I think at dinner time on Parliament TV. So you'll be able to see actually what happens when it does.
So that's another case of that, appointing role of the Governor-General there.
So the state opening involves quite a few more people. Of course, this is the day that the Governor-General actually comes over to Parliament. We've got the Sergeant also in the ceremony, the Herald, as we've discussed before. The Usher of the Black Rod is someone who we haven't talked about before, but they serve as the Governor-General's messenger for ceremonial communications, and they'll summon the members of Parliament to come from the debating chamber into the Legislative Council chamber to be with the Governor-General and hear the speech from the throne. So they serve that role. The judiciary.
It might be worth just jumping in there, Eva, and just in case anyone doesn't know, the Governor-General can't go into the debating chamber.
Yeah.
That's why she has the usher doing that communication for her, because she stays right out of people's chamber.
And that's reflected in the carpet here at Parliament as well. I believe it's the red carpet she's allowed on, but the green carpet, which is in the debating chamber, is not, which is quite novel. As we discussed before, there's a tikanga aspect to the ceremonies which has been built upon over the years, and I think the opening ceremonies are a really beautiful representation of our country today, and hopefully with COVID we'll be able to have all of those elements present and the public can come watch. It really is something. We also have the New Zealand Defence Force, which line the forecourt outside, a really impressive sight to see, and the band with the trumpets as well. So it really is a big affair, which is wonderful. So I
think that the ceremony is really good recognition of the mana whenua. the local hapu and who I guess have that connection with the local, the place where Parliament is situated.
Absolutely. So just to talk you through a little bit about the ceremony, as we said, there's a lot going on the forecourt, which the public can come and see in person. The Governor-General kind of inspects the troops outside and is greeted by the mana whenua when they arrive. And they make their way up the steps to go to the Legislative Council chamber. As we said, you can see the red carpet there very clearly, bright. And so the members are called from the debating chamber where they are through to here to listen to the speech from the throne, which is handed to her by the Prime Minister. And she has the joy of reading out and then hands to the Speaker, which is then tabled in the House. And what happens after the speech from the throne is that the Governor-General will leave, the members will file back into the debating chamber, and they'll usually begin the address and reply debate. So this can vary depending on what happens in the address and reply debate, but a few important things are the appointment of deputy and assistant speakers, as well as usually there'll be some maiden speeches of the new MPs, and maiden speeches I enjoy them. They're quite interesting. You hear about why a member perhaps has, put themselves forward to be a representative, and kind of a bit about them and their families. So yeah, would encourage you to listen along to those when they occur. Yeah.
A really rich symbolism of the ceremony and all the different branches of the state, I guess. The judiciary there, the legislature and the executive, all I guess they're unified by the Governor-General.
And the address and reply debate is also a response to the speech from the throne. So the members take an opportunity perhaps to pick up on a few things that have been, the government's plans for the next 3 years, and, to respond to that. So it can be quite a long debate, I think usually around 19 hours. Obviously spread over quite a few days. Yeah,
and they do that without any disrespect to the Governor-General, because she didn't write the speech. It's really clear that it's delivered to her as part of the advice that's provided by the Prime Minister, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's literally her laying out her government's plans for the next term as provided to her by her government. So it's definitely not her interpretation of what the government should be doing. It's the Prime Minister's speech.
That's right. And in the address and reply debate, when the opposition will tend to move a motion of no confidence, it's a motion of no confidence in the government and their disagreement with the policies that are in the speech. It's no sign of disrespect to the Governor-General. It's obviously very much the political debate that occurs sort of under the Governor-General's oversight, I guess you could say.
Wonderful.
Cool. So hopefully that's piqued your interest in the opening of Parliament, and you're keen to watch the ceremonies when they happen. Fortunately, there are quite a few ways you can do that, as you can see here. So firstly, you actually can come and watch the start of the state opening in person on the Parliament lawn. Otherwise, we are live streaming the entire ceremony on our Facebook page. You can also watch the live broadcast on Parliament TV via the channels you see on the screen there. You can also listen to the audio of the ceremonies on Radio New Zealand. And lastly, we will be live streaming the ceremonies on our website, on our Parliament On Demand page of our website as well.
So basically, John, you're saying people have no excuse for not watching.
Exactly, yeah, no excuse. Once the dates are finalised, we all expect you to tune in to this important ceremony.
Yeah.
Yep. And just to point out that we will be offering New Zealand Sign Language interpretation for the ceremonies. And that brings us to the Q&A. So I'd just like to take this chance to thank our presenters for an excellent, insightful presentation. And we have been receiving quite a few questions, so I'll just sort of run through them in order. The first one relates to the formation of a new government, and they've said, in the UK, I understand the old PM, Prime Minister, has to make the recommendation about there being a new Prime Minister. Is that not how it's done in New Zealand?
So the answer to that is no, that's not how it's done here. So as Heather was saying, once it's clear who the next person will be, the outgoing Prime Minister will drive across town in Wellington to Government House. Incidentally, the car they will use is the one that is reserved for the Prime Minister, the one with that number plate that says CR1. They arrive here and they tender their resignation and go away. And they do not tender advice to the Crown. Not that I'm aware of at any rate, not that I'm in the room. Then they get in the car, and the car that's to take them back is no longer the Prime Minister's one. There's a little bit of quick logistics. And the new person arrives, and then the ceremony takes place, and that's also when the car passes from one person to the other. But there's an important constitutional angle in this. If the outgoing Prime Minister comes to the Governor-General and tenders advice, well, until the moment of their resignation, they are still the Prime Minister, but there would have to be a question about whether that advice should be taken, because it's clear to all that that person no longer has a mandate from the House of Representatives, the new one that's being formed, and therefore can't speak for the public. So it would be very murky territory constitutionally if such advice were to be given.
Yeah. So I guess we've got the caretaker convention that kind of covers that sort of scenario, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. There are stories out there about Queen Elizabeth being given advice in the 1960s from an outgoing Prime Minister who was resigning for health reasons, I think, on which person to send for. And I believe that advice was taken. It probably should not have been, but it doesn't happen here, not in our day at any rate.
Excellent, thanks, Greg. The next question was, it relates to the opening of Parliament. So what Parliament was the Queen opening in January 1954? Wasn't the 1954 election in November?
It was a special session. It was
Yeah.
a special session of Parliament, so it was a bit different.
That's well picked
Kind
up.
of made a special session just so she could open it.
Yeah, I mean, we used to have sessions every year. We used to have an opening of Parliament every year until about 1984 or thereabouts, and occasionally thereafter. But like Parliament used to be chopped up into sessions, you know, so it tended to be every year, and they had a special ceremony that year when she arrived. Last year in the UK, there was a bit of a palaver about what's called prorogation, which is something that the sovereign can do to suspend sittings of the House or sittings of Parliament and then have another opening, and that would have happened back then. We don't really do the prorogation thing here anymore. It's still in the Constitution Act. It could happen, but it just simply has fallen out of practice, really. And we have the Prime Minister kicks off every year with a statement about what the government intends to do that year, and that's kind of what used to happen in those annual openings of Parliament. But yeah, definitely when, and who knows when the sovereign returns to New Zealand, we might have another special session. Who knows what might happen at that point?
Yeah, thanks for that. Next question is, what do atheists do an oath with?
I could have been clearer, sorry. I guess, yes, MPs have a choice about whether they want to do an oath or affirmation, and an affirmation doesn't use a holy book. So I guess if someone doesn't have faith, they would choose to do an affirmation. It doesn't make, I think, reference to God or a higher being, but still swears allegiance to the sovereign and
affirms it, I guess. And,
so yeah, that is definitely an option for them.
Cool. And just the last question I can see here. So it's they've said, I thought the opposition usually didn't move a motion of no confidence in the first opportunity after an election.
Oh well, that's up to them. There is an opportunity for them when they return from the speech from the throne, when they commence the address and reply debate. There is sometimes an opportunity, or there is an opportunity for them to move a motion of no confidence if they wish, as a way of testing the government's majority. But of course, even if they don't, at the end of that debate, there is a motion on, a decision on that motion about the address and reply. So whether to accept or I guess what are the terms of the House's response to the Governor General, which is usually just a respectful response, basically thanking Her Excellency for her time, I guess. But they can add words as a motion of no confidence. But even if they don't, the decision on the address and reply is voted on. So that's another opportunity for the House to express its confidence or no confidence.
And there is another small ceremony, isn't there, Greg, up at Government House after the address and reply is kind of complete, it's presented.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. The address and reply is presented to the Governor General. So it's a beautiful small ceremony that really brings to a close in a ceremonial sense the whole process of transitioning from the 52nd Parliament, as we're doing now, to the 53rd, or one Parliament to the next. So you're right, the ceremonial aspect does play out in that regard also.
Oh, thanks for that. And I think that brings us to the end of the questions and answers.
Oh, some great questions there.
Yeah, excellent questions. So I'd just like to take this opportunity as we wrap up to once again thank our presenters for an excellent webinar today. And while the Parliament buildings are still closed to the public, you still can take a virtual tour of Parliament through our Parliament XI app. That's free on both on Android and Apple phones. So if you just if you search for Parliament XI on your app store, you can download a free virtual tour of Parliament. And if you want to keep up with news from Parliament and also learn more about the upcoming opening of Parliament, please follow our social media channels. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So yeah, that brings us to the end of our presentation. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned a lot. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Kia ora.